Joel Green. I am a senior professor of New Testament interpretation at Fuller Seminary. I've been back and forth across the U.S. teaching over the last 40 years, but have spent these last 15 years at Fuller Seminary in Southern California. I'm a pastor ordained. I've written a number of books and edited a number of books, including, I think, one that just was published in France, Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. So the one we're talking about today would be, I think, my second this year. There's sort of two answers to your question, why the book at all? And the answer, of course, is for students, for people who are interested in reading the New Testament and want to have some ways of getting into their interpretation, their study. Really, in the last 35 or so years, there's just been a smorgasbord of approaches to reading New Testament texts, and that can be a little overwhelming. And so what we wanted to do was try to bring some discipline to it, some sensibility to it. And so I wanted to help students, people who are trying to get a toehold on working with New Testament texts. And I also want to do a little more than what sometimes happens with books like this. Often a book like this might just introduce an approach, an interpretive method, and so on. I went a little bit further than that. I wanted to introduce, but also illustrate. And so everybody who writes an essay introducing a method was also given the task of illustrating that method. And we used 5 different texts, what I call set texts. And they had to choose at least one of them in order to show what it looks like. What are the steps you go through? What's the pattern you follow as you put into play an interpretive approach? And I should mention that, why didn't you just write the book yourself instead of edit it? Because it's a lot easier to write than it is to edit. But I wanted to involve people who were really committed to the method or the approach that they were taking. I wanted them to provide the most positive perspective on what they were doing, so that our readers would get a kind of thumbs up version of reading through a method. It's a good question, because here in the U.S., of course, people are picking up their New Testament, their Bibles, in English or in Spanish, let's say, maybe Korean or Chinese. Where you are, of course, they pick them up in French. And there's a tendency just to assume that you're reading a contemporary writer. So you're working with modern assumptions. And so you might just walk along thinking that all people everywhere in all times think and act like I do, or think and act like you do. So I think one of the biggest challenges is simply what we assume. Or to put it differently, reading the New Testament is an act of intercultural communication. So it means taking seriously that people come from another time and place. And translations are therefore, they're so important, but they can also be a little off-putting in the sense that they might provide more comfort than might be needed as people try to address a text that was, actually written 2,000 years ago. Most of the methods then are really attempts to try to deal with the what you might call the locatedness of Matthew or Romans or First Peter. This time and place, that time and place, that way of reading, this way of reading, this way of phrasing things, that way of reading, phrasing things. So really, it's a way of trying to do two things at once. If this doesn't sound too paradoxical, on the one hand, distance ourselves from the text so that we don't just, act as though my neighbor next door did it, but at the same time familiarize ourselves with the text so that we're able to glean, learn from it in ways that are really formative for us. I've been thinking about New Testament interpretation in light of some sports things going on right now. We just had FIFA, and we now have FIBA before us, and I think about it because as everyone would know, you don't just go play a basketball game. You don't just go play a football game. You have to practice dribbling, and you have to practice shooting, and you have to practice all of the different aspects of the game. And then when the game happens, it all comes together. And there's a sense in which that's what the book is trying to do, is trying to, break down certain aspects of the process of reading the New Testament, not so that you can do one by itself or these two, but not those five, but so that you can do whatever you need to do in order to make the game of interpretation take place. Now, the way that this book operates is that we break up the various interpretive methods into three categories. They're categories from recours, actually, behind the text, in the text, and in front of the text. And so there are a number of things that one might do with behind the text. You might want to know what's going on in the Judaism of Jesus' day. That means he's going to respond the way he does, let's say, to the temple in John chapter 2. You might want to know what's going on in the larger Roman world, the Mediterranean world, that Paul is concerned about when he writes the Corinthians. So there's a number of behind the text issues you can struggle with. Then there's the in the text, that is the text that's sitting in front of you. There's literary techniques, narrative techniques, the study of words, and then there in front of the text, the things that we bring with us to the text, because none of us comes, naked to the text, clean. We come with all of who we are, our commitments, and so on. And we might want to be aware of those. In fact, we do want to be aware of those, so that we don't just read ourselves into the New Testament text. So this book goes through a whole variety of behind the text, in the text, and in front of the text approaches to reading the New Testament. Should we privilege one over the other, or use several? I think the bottom line is we're always using several. It's impossible to use them all. But one of the things I try to explain to my students is that you come to a text, and the text itself will begin to raise questions, and then you'll need the right tool, the right approach in order to address that question. If all you have in your toolbox is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. But if you have more than that, then you can look at different approaches. You can answer different kinds of questions. Another example I use with my students is that if you think of the New Testament text as a landscape, then there are a variety of ways of reading that landscape. You can use a telescope. You can use a right angle lens. You can use a microscope. You can dig the dirt underneath it. You can study the flora. You can study the animals. All kinds of things you can do. And each of them is right. But none of them is complete. And in the same way, New Testament interpretation, different methods give you insight into different aspects of the text. And the real question is, what is it that you want? What is it you're trying to understand? And then also, what are the issues that this text raises for you? And then what methods do you put to use in order to make sense of the text? But let me just give an illustration. Luke 19, 1-10 is the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus. Well, you could try to make sense of that text all by itself, sort of slice it out of Luke, no 18 chapters before it, no 5 chapters after it, and just look at that text. Or you could try to read it within the framework of the Gospel of Luke. And if you do that, you start seeing some interesting things. So Zacchaeus is a wealthy man, and you just go back and think about everything you've learned about wealthy people in Luke 1-18. And you find that without fail, wealthy people resist Jesus' message. And so you might say to yourself, oh my, Zacchaeus, he must be one of those people who's going to resist Jesus. But Luke also calls him a toll collector, a tax collector. And then you go back to chapters 1-18 and you say, oh my goodness, tax collectors respond positively toward Jesus. They embrace the gospel. And you just see how, in a sense, Luke has prepared us to read Zacchaeus. And you might say to yourself, will the real Zacchaeus stand up? Because he looks like he's going to be resisting Jesus, but then it looks like he's going to be embracing the good news. And in fact, Jesus calls him a child of Abraham and says salvation has come. Well, that's just a little bit of an example of how paying attention to in the text material helps you make sense of a famous text like Zacchaeus. Thanks. The bottom line is I am continually an interpreter of New Testament texts. And I do it for myself, for church communities, for my seminary, and for a wider audience. And I see that as a profound responsibility. And I would be forever grateful for ongoing prayer in that way, in terms of the vocation God has put before me. Thanks for asking.